say something that it'll be helpful to you and your listeners because it massively simplifies the entire field of Western philosophy. So, not a lot of people know this. Everyone, I think, who's read the Greek philosophers has heard about the Delphic Oracle, right? And people maybe don't realise that Delphi, which is just outside Athens, like it would have been a couple of days' journey in the ancient world. The Delphic Oracle was the priestess of Apollo. Apollo's kind of like a patron god of philosophy. He's, in a sense, the spokesperson of Zeus. He's the son of Zeus, almost like a Christ figure in some ways. And his priestess, he spoke through his priestess. She was possessed by him and channeled him. And so Apollo, speaking through the Pythia, would make these pronouncements. We have 147 of them, if I remember rightly, that are preserved today. They're almost like Zen koans. Most of them are 2 words in Greek. And Plutarch, who was a priest at Delphi of Apollo, and also a famous Platonist philosopher, said these little sayings, he said, are like seeds. They're very ambiguous and they're very short, but many volumes of philosophical texts have been written elaborating on them. Like a koan, it's so much meaning just packed into a couple of words. Now, the 2 most, you don't have to, I'm not going to tell you all 147, right? There's only 2 you need to know. The 2 most famous ones were engraved on the pillar at the entrance to the Temple of Apollo. And one of them is Gnothai Seauton, which means know thyself. Everybody's had that, it's a cliche. And it's a motif of all ancient philosophy, particularly in the Socratic tradition. It's the kind of seed, or the undercurrent that runs through it all. And the other one is Medan Agan, which means nothing in excess, or all things in moderation. Right? And this is also a recurring motif throughout most ancient philosophy, but particularly in Socrates and in the Stoics. This idea, and also it plays a similar role, slightly different role in Aristotle's philosophy. Now, those 2 sayings, maxims, are related, because in order to know what's in excess or what's too much, you would need to know your own character and nature. You have to know yourself to know what's too much for you. As I was mentioning earlier when we were talking about sparring and exposure therapy and stuff like that, and what Epictetus says about people having to make a judgment for themselves about whether to approach something or whether to avoid it, or when, what's too much for them to take on. There's a famous example. He says that, and this example may go back to Zeno's Republic. We're told, we know very little about Zeno's Republic, but we know that he describes human society like a herd of cattle. And so it's interesting in later Stoics when they mention cattle as a metaphor, it could be that they're alluding to the what was said in Zeno's Republic, right? Maybe. We don't know. We'll never know. So Epictetus very famously, though, says, and I say famously because if you ever read, one of the few novels about Stoicism is Tom Wolfe's book, A Man in Full, and this passage in Epictetus figures quite prominently in A Man in Full. And in it, Epictetus says, how does a bull know whether it can kill a lion? So he said in every herd there's like a dominant, like an alpha, like bull, and it protects the weaker members of the herd against a lion. Now, I thought that was weird at first, because being Scottish, I'd never really seen this. So I kind of spent a bit of time looking into it, and I was, oh yeah, sure, like a bull can do nasty things to a lion. Like it'll throw the lion in the air on its horns, like tosses it in the air. It makes a short work of it potentially. But lions also hunt calves, and so Epictetus would say, how do you know whether you're a calf or a bull? Like, how does it know whether it can fight a lion who's going to get eaten by it, or is it going to like toss it in its horns? Like, and Epictetus says, you know from experience, basically gradually growing up, the bulls will the calves will tussle with each other, and they gradually, through experience, learn to understand their own strength, their own nature, by knowing yourself, by studying yourself. No one's going to come and tell you. Like, you can trust them to. They can say, hey, sure, honestly, buddy, you could take out a lion. Like, you know, I don't know if you want to believe that guy. You know, can you take that for granted? Can you take that guy at his word? And I think I want to kind of like, you know, maybe try myself out on a slightly bigger calf first and see how that goes. Like,
Yeah.
but he said through trial and error, growing up, and through kind of like through same as sparring. How do you know if you can beat the world champion? Well, you wrestle a bunch of other people,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And then you kind of figure out either kicking your ass every time, like, or you're doing pretty well. Like, well, if you've beat everyone else, then maybe you've got a chance, like beating the, you know, the world champion. But if you're getting your butt kicked every time, then maybe you don't. But you have to put yourself out there in steps and stages and study your own behaviour in order to understand your strengths and weaknesses. That's the point that he's making. So know thyself and nothing in excess. You know, this is wisdom and temperance, which are the two of the main. We talked about justice, one of the cardinal virtues earlier. Wisdom and temperance are two of wisdom, obviously, in all philosophy. The virtue of temperance or self-discipline is a major motif in Stoic philosophy and in general. The Stoics were known, if anything, for being similar to Socrates, except that in part one of the differences is that they place, and Socrates put a lot of emphasis on temperance and self-control, but the Stoics put even more emphasis on training and self-discipline than Socrates.